the fundamental aim for the global capitalist class has been to control demographic trend. It's not only just only committed to, under any condition, population growth or forcing women to reproduce. No, many women have been sterilized. Parallel with the denial of contraceptive, there's also been a whole history, for example, of sterilization of Black women. The moment in which they envision the newborn as potential rebel, they envision the newborn as potential rebellious subject, then comes sterilization. And I think we have to look at it this way. Almost today, obviously, there is in a lot of places a fear of the fact that a lot of women, particularly white women, are not reproducing themselves. It's not only a question of numbers, it's also a question of what kind of children they want to see reproduced. It's not just forcing women to reproduce, it's under what condition.
Hello and welcome to Planet Critical, the podcast for a world in crisis. My name is Rachel Donald. I'm a climate corruption journalist and your host. Every week I interview experts who are battling to save our planet. My guests are scientists, politicians, academics, journalists, and activists. They explain the complexities of the energy, economic, political, and cultural crises we face today, revealing what's really going on and what they think needs to be done. These are the stories of the big picture. Go to planetcritical.com to learn more and subscribe. My guest this week is Silvia Federici. Silvia is a scholar and a Marxist-feminist activist. She's the author of multiple ecofeminist books, including Caliban and the Witch, Women, the Body, and Primitive Accumulation. I read Caliban and the Witch as part of my research for the book I'm writing, Her Body, Our Choice, and reached out to Silvia to discuss her profound research, which shows how the enclosure of female bodies and the disempowerment of women was necessary for the creation of capitalism. On this episode, we discuss exactly that, framing her research into the peasant movement 500 years ago within the context of the regression of women's rights today. She explains the particularities of feminist movements around the world and gives a thorough Marxist-feminist analysis of how women's work and women's bodies have always been the cornerstone of reproduction. And reproduction, not just in the sense of human procreation, but the caretaking of earth, the growing of gardens, educating children, caretaking for our communities, and why undermining this fundamental power, whilst also appropriating the work as an economic resource, is absolutely instrumental to the accumulation of the capitalist class. And it is imperative that this analysis be taken up again by the feminist movement in the West if we are to combat these violences against Earth's body and women's bodies, which are not as different as they may appear on the surface. I hope you all enjoy the episode. If you do, please share it far and wide. And if you're loving the show, become a patron on Patreon or support Planet Critical with a paid subscription at planetcritical.com. By signing up, you'll get the Planet Critical newsletter inspired by each episode delivered straight to your inbox every week. You'll also have access to the wonderful Planet Critical community who are full of inspiring thoughts, ideas, critiques, and determination. The links are in the description box below. I'm so grateful to everyone who chooses to support the project. I'm a vehement believer in ad-free and open access content, so Planet Critical wouldn't exist without the direct support of the amazing community. Thank you so much to all of you who believe in Planet Critical and keep the project going every week. Silvia, thank you so much for joining me on Planet Critical. It is such a pleasure to have you on the show.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
It's a real honor to invite you and to be able to speak to you, especially after having recently read Caliban and the Witch, which is a hugely important text in the feminist canon, I think, especially sort of the eco-feminist canon. So I'm really excited to get into it, like really excited. But I have to give you the first question everybody gets, which is, why is the world in crisis?
Okay, so that, of course, is a huge question. But let's start to say that that question implies at least two different answers. One is why it is in crisis. I think it is in crisis. One answer is that it is in crisis because across the world, the majority of the world population is now living under conditions that are desperate, that are catastrophic from every point of view, which means they do not have the resources that they need for their reproduction. They live in countries that are, under condition of constant warfare of different types, because we are now living in a situation in which we have governments, the most important governments of the world, that are in fact presiding over, the destruction of basically with their politics of so many communities, beginning, for example, with the genocidal war and attack on Gaza, and not beyond Gaza, the Sudan, the Congo. So, and of course, we are heading towards, even further catastrophic conditions because of the climate crisis, which is, we know, produced. It's not a natural phenomenon, but is in fact the result of very specific policies, economic policies. So this is to say that there is a crisis. There is such a crisis that, in fact, you know, people many question, to what extent, life on Earth, will continue. But there's also another kind of answer, which is, what are the root causes? What is producing this crisis? Why we are now in such a dire situation? And here, the answer is that we are, living, the decisions that are structuring the life, the reproductive capacity and activities of much of the world are taken, are shaped by a social system that now for centuries, has gained more and more power, prioritizing systematically, systemically prioritizing the accumulation of private wealth over the reproduction of people's lives, right? So we're talking about capitalism, we're talking about capitalist development. So that in fact, the capitalist development that, extending further and further into every part of the world and subjecting to itself, more aspects of human life, through a whole process of alienation, commodification, exploitation of people, resources, and nature, is now, in fact, basically undermining the ability of communities and the earth itself to reproduce itself, right? So we have the earth system itself, and when I mean earth, I mean rivers, I mean ocean, I mean waters, I mean the air, is in fact, under a tremendous attack. So this would be my response. Yes, we have evidence. The evidence is everywhere to see. It's in fact quite terrifying, and we have also a system, an unjust, a cruel and exploitative social system, which unfortunately is now extended to every part of the world, taking different forms and affecting people and community, not in a uniform way, because obviously not every community, clearly, you know, people have been colonized, Black people, and women, working class people are affected in a much more severe way. But it's a system that nevertheless is shaping and prioritizing, as I said before, the accumulation of wealth over the well-being. And fortunately, there are also many forces that are fighting against it. There's a tremendous resistance, and this is what I think is giving us another vision, of what is shaping life on this planet.
Sylvia, thank you so much. To begin, I'd like to dig into this idea of reproduction. I was very interested when I started the research for my own book that we speak about the Earth's reproductive carrying capacity, which is how many resources can be extracted, and that zone, that ecosystem, whatever, can continue to regenerate and produce those resources again and again and again. What is a people's capacity for reproduction? And can you speak to, obviously, not just the female body, but then what the female body carries culturally, and the resources that are required in order for a people to reproduce themselves?
Yeah, and I mean, women have been, in fact, the main subject of reproductive activity, not only through procreation, but actually, through, a whole set of activity that have produced, for example, the production of food, the cultivation of the earth, the discovery of the powers. I think the women have. Over the century, for example, you know, by studying the properties of the earth, of the herbs, they um, they have in fact transformed many of the earth products into something that could uh, produce life.
Mm.
Women have been those who have selected the seeds, and turn, for example, a lot of uh, natural products in something that was edible. So the production of food, has certainly been one of the main contribution, cultural and material contribution of women to the reproduction of life. Also, many care work activities, the caring of children, the education, the child raising, and women have learned about the medical property, for example, of herbs and foods, um, and they have produced many of the materials that are necessary for everyday life, textiles, baskets, to preserve things. Um, so, in fact, I think that women's anthropologists, there is now a very interesting and vast literature by women anthropologists who have changed, our understanding, of what some people would call, the development of civilization, showing, contesting, the image, of men being the one who brought, progress and into the world, right? The Prometheus view of man who invents the fire. And they pointed out that if anything, it was women who in fact created, all the material condition, for people to thrive, because the very necessity that originated by the reproduction of life, the taking care of such a fragile life as an infant, you know, taking care of the process of procreation, as meant they had to invent, they had to sedentarize, for example, the building of huts, no, and the building of materials capable of preserving the foodstuff, all of this, so there's been a transformation, a revolution, a theoretical revolution in the understanding as to what has actually been able to produce and reproduce life, and show that in fact, with the very necessity that came, from women's capacity to procreate, to raise children, has meant also the whole cultural production. And I think this is very important. So when we talk about reproduction, we are talking about a very broad concept. When we began to discuss this question in the feminist movement, at first, we really concentrated, on the question of procreation. This was the most obvious, there was most obvious terrain, right? And here, for example, we know that 3,000 years before Christ, women already knew system to control, like some of the references to birth control devices, come from Egyptian papyruses dating 3,000 years before Christ, right? So the idea that in fact we had to wait for the pills of the 19th century to be able to have contraception, women have always tried to find ways to control. And then reproduction, we concentrated on the question of procreation, but then more and more, right, became the issue of child raising, food production, agriculture, education, medical care, and the broader sense of care work. So that in fact, reproduction has many, many, many sides, involve many, many activities, all of which are interconnected, right? And so I'm thinking here, for example, of the beautiful essay by Vandana Shiva in their book called Staying Alive, where she talks about the forest, what the forest is meant for the people who lived in forest, and beginning also with women. How the forest is an entire reproductive system, because in the forest you have fruits, you have roots, you have medical herbs, right? And you also have, the quiet and space that generates spiritual activity. So we have seen that reproduction is a broad, complex, interesting complex of interconnected material and cultural spiritual activities. And the women not unique. I mean, I don't suggest that women have been alone, in developing reproductive system, but certainly women have been the central subject of reproduction and continue to be, regardless of the fact that now so many women are involved also in commodity production. But nevertheless, women continue to be the primary caretaker of human beings and the primary caretaker of the earth. In fact, I think that you travel throughout Latin America, and you know that now women are in the front line in the struggle against extractivist activities, because they know that once the water is polluted, right, or once the earth is desertified and there is no water and they have to walk miles and miles and miles to be able to get water, this is a disastrous. And so women have been fighting, and in fact, the increase of violence, you probably know the work of Rita Segato. This is one person that you should definitely interview in your podcast, because she has written about the new form of violence against women. The women have been the subject of male violence, institutional violence for centuries, but these new forms of violence that have to do also with the fact that the women are now so much in the front line in the defense of their community and defense of the earth against these new forms of extractivism. And I think the feminist movement itself has grown, has actually broadened, because from the kind of analysis that we concentrated upon when we started discussing reproduction, which was mostly housework, domestic work, and of course sexual work, is now really very much expanded. For example, the whole ecological issue, right? Already with ecofeminism, that in fact the reproduction is not only in the home but outside the home. In many places, it begins in the fields. It begins in the fields with the planting of the seed or the selecting of the seeds. Right? Women have been the ones who have selected the genetic material, right? And in many societies, they continue to do that. One of the responses, to agribusiness, has been the creation and to seed banks. I know in several countries of the Caribbean, of Latin America, women are now part of feminist activities, the creation of seed banks. So that you don't have to depend on agribusiness companies. You don't have to depend on Monsanto, right? And you don't have to depend on genetically modified seeds, right?
Yeah.
So this is
When I opened up Caliban and the Witch, and began reading. And you say it repeatedly, and in a very nuanced way, but I think it was the first time I'd ever seen it written down. And you spoke about how the necessary literature, anti-capitalist literature, that had been developed in the 19th century, particularly Marx, had done extraordinary work of depicting the necessary violence that capitalism comes into the world with. That capitalism is not born naturally, it is a rupture of existing social relations. But that he had envisioned that there was a sort of sexless universal proletariat that was
Mm.
impacted by capitalism the same. And you wrote, no, there is a sexual division of labor. There is a
Yes.
difference in women's bodies and men's bodies.
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
so how capitalism came into the world and the necessary violences that were enacted against women in order for the rupture of capitalism to happen were particular, and we need to discuss them. And I think it was the first time I'd ever seen that written down, something that does feel very instinctive, especially
Mhm.
as we are seeing women's rights rolled back in quote unquote developed countries. Um, so, what is this relationship then between the private accumulation of wealth and the enclosure
Mhm.
of women's bodies?
Yes. Well, Marx speaks of women, but speaks of this. Marx does a reference, but speaks mostly of the difference between women's work and men's work in the factory,
Mm,
right? And also both Marx and Engels really envisioned a world, their conception of progress of a post-capitalist world, where in effect, and this is one of the things that I've criticized, and I'm not alone in that, where women who join men, in the process of production, right? Whereas in capitalism, they're often, secluded in the domestic world, right? So it speaks about it, but it doesn't see the centrality of women's work. And that's a whole discussion why it didn't see that. But yes, I think that one of the great contribution of the feminist movement, and in the 17 and after, has been in fact to see that, and this is the rupture with the tradition of the left, that has never really seen the importance of reproductive work as fundamental, in the expansion, accumulation, in the capitalist accumulation of wealth,
mm,
right? This concentration that the socialist and Marxist tradition, has placed on the factory production,
mm,
commodity production, and wage labor, particularly the wage labor as being the site, wage work, the site of capitalist accumulation, and also the site of the possibility of subversion. So the wage worker is potentially the revolutionary subject. And I think that because the one of the factors that I think has also helped this change of perspective has also been the anti-colonial struggle, through the 60s and even before. No, we have seen a major, major process. I would say the 20th century, one of the most important, historical development in the 20th century has been the struggle of the colonized, and which have, in a sense, really changed the perspective as to who have been the workers, the social subject
mhm.
that have been most important for the history and production of for the accumulation of capitalist wealth, right? I think the anti-colonial struggle and has really opened up a new conception, right? In a sense, it has displaced the wage worker as the primary subject
Yeah.
and actually shown that capitalism has accumulated its wealth mostly through enslavement, through colonization, right? To the really intense, much more intense exploitation that ever wage workers have suffered. And I think this decentering of the place of capitalist accumulation and anti-capitalist struggle has also affected the perspective of women. I think the ones that all view, once the whole idea that wage labor and wage work are where we have to look at to see, the history of capitalism, then I think it becomes also possible to think of the position of women, because in the socialist tradition, women's struggle is always a struggle which is supplementary to the male struggle, supportive of the male struggle. But there's never a conception that women have suffered specific form of exploitation. And I think that the influence, the impact of the anti-colonial struggle has enabled women to see that there is actually very specific, that the majority of women, proletarian women, obviously not the women of the ruling class, but the majority of women in capitalism, right, have been not, of course, we're speaking of women in slavery, but also proletarian women have been the subject of a very specific form of exploitation. And the exploitation that has come through reproductive work. Yeah, and has enabled us to see that this work is fundamental for the reproduction of capital. And yet, right, and extremely lucrative, because it has been naturalized, it has been denied this work, and therefore, I mean, all the work has been free labor. And I think that this I think is the contribution of the anti-colonial struggle and the feminist struggle has been to put at the center of the history of capitalism and the history of the anti-capitalist struggle the question of the division of labor. The question of the division of labor, both in terms of differential forms of exploitation, and to just move away from the unique concentration on wage labor, and to see that, in fact, other forms of exploitation have been even more important. That in capitalism, there's been a different kind of work, and those kind of work have been associated with different groups of people. So that there is a work for men, white men. There's a work for black men. There's a work for women. There's a work for white women, black women. The different forms of work have actually been associated with different groups and different forms of exploitation. This has been, I think, extremely, extremely important, because it's also changed the conception of what kind of struggle. It has changed the conception of understanding what is the architecture of capital exploitation, who are the fundamental subject of this exploitation, and therefore what kind of struggle we need to make, actually, to also, that is not only a question of organizing a strike, but also fighting against the hierarchies. How do we deal with the hierarchies, the capitalism, which have also created tremendous division within the working class? Understanding also the capitalism has been able to perpetuate itself, but having part of the working class control the other part. White men controlling women, controlling black people, etc., all of that. So I think that has been extremely important, right? This restructuring of what is the history of capitalist labor, and therefore what is the history of anti-capitalist struggle, and what kind of organizational forms. I don't know if yes. Now,
Yeah,
where
no,
yeah,
this is
yeah.
absolutely fascinating. How can we understand the rolling back, undermining, overturning, destruction of women's reproductive rights in a country like the United States through this frame? How can we understand it as more than a sort of like neo-reactionary misogyny, which I do feel is sort of where a lot of the mainstream critique ended. This is just men that who hate women. Well, hang on, what else is going on here? For me, it seemed to be about something to do with literally producing more labor power in a country whose population was,
And more
you know,
white people, yes,
and more
yes,
white people, exactly, especially as immigration is sort of flooding in.
yeah,
And when I was
yeah,
reading your book and I was looking at how women's this is not the first time that this has happened. Um,
yes,
the
yeah,
proletarian women, sort of
mm,
500 years ago, had their bodies and their knowledge enclosed so as to be forced
yeah.
into the home. It then started to get me thinking about how, well, this is an excellent way to impeach women from being able to participate fully in political life by settling with children they don't want.
But also more than that,
Mhm,
first of all, it's very important to see that, the obligation of women to procreate is not universal. First of all, it's not universal,
mhm,
right? I mean, if you look at the history of from the 1980s, end of the 70s to present, you will also see, right, that there's been a, really huge worldwide campaign, to force women in many parts of the world to not reproduce,
mhm,
right? I remember all through the 80s and part of the 90s, we've heard about the fact there is poverty into the world is because overpopulation. The threat, the population,
yeah,
remember the population explosion early. A lot of capitalist demographers have insisted over and over and over on the fact that, poverty in the world is overpopulation
mm,
and population growth is a threat. And it's not only been an ideological campaign, but actually it's translated into massive, massive program of sterilization and from Indonesia, India, Africa, everywhere, for decades, there's been a program of, not only teaching women about birth control, or at least that, but actually, you know, think of the production of contraceptive like Depo-Provera and so on that women cannot control. The ones implanted,
mhm,
women
mhm,
cannot actually don't have the capacity to control them. The hiring of so many health workers that will go village upon village, convincing women to have this injection, to use
mm,
this content. So the sterilization safaris, and I've always interpreted that. I always interpreted this, initiative also as response. For example, response to the anti-colonial struggle, the fear now of the third world, right? The
mhm,
fear now, the new generation of Africa, new generation of people from the Caribbean, from Africa, demanding a return of the wealth that has been expropriated from them,
mhm,
right? Not only building, continuing the process of decolonization, but also looking now at the wealth, of the Americas, of the Europe, as saying, yes, your wealth is the wealth that is being taken away from us. And so the moment in which, capitalism is confronting, a struggle, a broad, anti-colonial, not only anti-colonial struggle, but the new generation of then the question of population explosion. And I think we have to look at it that way, th- that the demographic policies, are never one of the, I think is very important. I think I have learned looking at the history of capitalism, that the fundamental aim, for the global capitalist class has been to able to control demographic trend.
mm,
You know, It's not only just only committed to under any condition population growth
mm,
or forcing women to reproduce. No, many women have been sterilized.
mm,
Parallel with the denial of contraceptive, there's also been a whole history, for example, of sterilization of Black women,
mhm,
right? The moment in which they envision the newborn as potential rebel, they envision the newborn as potential rebellious subject, then comes sterilization. And I think we have to look at it this way. Almost today, obviously, there is in a lot of places a fear of the fact that a lot of women, particularly white women, are not reproducing themselves. It's not only a question of numbers, it's also a question of what kind of children they want to see reproduced, right?
Mhm.
So, the denial of abortion and the denial of contraceptives also coming,
Mhm.
with
Mhm.
a whole set of initiatives, a whole set of legislation that are making it more and more difficult, for people for the poor to reproduce themselves, right? And in fact, there's been a reduction in population growth in recent years because of the fact that many women do not want to reproduce under this difficult condition that are now confronting in their lives. So I think I think to me this is a very important. It's not just forcing women to reproduce. It's
Mm.
under what condition?
Mm.
Because actually many women are not being allowed to reproduce.
Mhm. Mhm.
There are many women are finding more and more difficult
Mhm.
to, yeah.
Mhm. I think I had understood it as evidence of a hugely sort of dematerialized capitalist class who had
Mhm.
enjoyed an explosion in the capacity to accumulate wealth due to
Mhm.
digitization and the increasing alienation of Earth's body from the final
Mhm.
product. That our political spheres, our neoclassical economists, our neoliberal economists, I mean, everyone had just sort of seemed to have forgotten where wealth comes from. Like it doesn't just come from labor power, it also comes from Earth's body directly.
Mhm.
And to me, given that the sort of past 5, 10 years, we've started to see an increasing awareness of resource scarcity, whether that
Mhm.
be through crops being damaged due to
Mhm.
climate change, droughts happening, oil prices spiking, and fracking becoming more and more and more expensive, that maybe the capitalist class kind of awoke again to the understanding that all of their wealth is actually driven by natural resources, and
Mhm.
thus the human body is a resource to exploit. When we run out
Mhm.
of Earth's bodies to
Mhm.
exploit in the same way, we can supplement that with labor power, essentially.
Well, absolutely, absolutely. But the body, okay, so there's the labor power, right? But there's been absolutely, actually, Maria Mies, I don't know, has spoken. Maria Mies now, well, her work has been fundamental in this way. She passed away, in 2024. But the 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 human body has become one of the main sources of exploitation, not only through procreation, but also through the use of body parts, right? For example, the new reproductive technology
Mm,
that that have been a huge, huge source of accumulation,
mm,
right? For example, in enabling women who cannot reproduce to reproduce, right? To all kinds of, in vitro fertilization, the whole commerce in the body parts, for example, the use of the sperm, the use of placentas, etc., etc. So the body has become a factory, has been looked at by capitalism as a factory. And but I want to add something else to what I said before about the denial of contraceptive and the attack on abortion. I think it's very important what I said. I mean, the issue of, the capital knows that certainly what kind of wealth, right, the female body represents. They know. And so controlling the uterus, controlling female body has certainly been a historic aim, of every capitalist politics, and the ability to see that there's a tremendous wealth In other words, that procreation in capitalism is an economic force. Capitalism has also looked at demographic growth and procreation as key element of economic development, you know. So because that's really the production of labor power. At the same time, the denial of abortion and contraception, it's also part, and this is where this, I think, the second element, of the discipline of women.
Mm.
Capital. I think that the feminist movement and women's rebellions, against the discipline of the family, against the authority of man over their life, etc., etc., it's been a tremendous threat for the capitalist system. To be able to have the family has been a tremendous disciplining structure. It has been as disciplining as the factory. In fact, the family has been a particular type of factory. No, not only because it has been a center of production, the production not of commodity, but the commodity labor power. It has been the production of the commodity labor power, but also because, and of the disciplining, in the same way in which in the factory, you have the discipline of the workers. Similarly, you have the disciplining of women, and that whole structure, and of course the whole story of love, the role, as I wrote, they call it love, we call it unpaid labor, has been a tremendous, and but so the fact that the feminist critique of the family, the feminist, rebellion against the discipline of the family, it's also a threat. And so the reinstitution, the traditional family, all the Christian, this huge now, Christian evangelicals movement, right, that have reinstituted the family as and the male authority, and so to it's part of a whole reinstitution of a certain discipline of women, that the break of which I think has been very threatening.
I think it's helpful to think about exactly what you've just said, which and it's astonishing. It's totally astonishing to see it happening before our eyes, and also to see how quickly this regression
Yeah,
can take place. It's very revealing
yeah.
as somebody that grew up in the 90s in a second wave feminist household that was told, the world is your oyster, this is progress, the last century was progress,
Mhm.
look at what has happened. And then to
Yeah.
understand that even that progress was built upon exploitation. In fact, it was like facilitated by exploitation. And so it can all turn around in a heartbeat. And to look back 500 years and look at what happened to women, as you laid out in Caliban and the Witch, to show
Mhm.
how, back then women were at times leading peasant protests, they were leading revolts, they were using the commons to create subsistence
Still do,
economies. Sorry?
still do.
Still do. They were providing for their families. They were at the center of political lives. There was still a
Yeah.
patriarchal structure, but there was less of this sexual division of labor among the
Mm.
proletarian class then. And so it was women's power and women's position and women's capacity to control their reproductive cycles that was essentially demolished. And that was what the witch hunt was. It was trying to subjugate women across the European world, and then it took the success of that and applied it to the Americas.
Which is still
Mm.
continuing. There's witch hunts now in many parts of the world.
Yes, yes. I've seen horrific stuff from investigating in Papua New Guinea. Women still being burned at the stake
I
um,
know.
for being.
And in India and
Mhm,
in many parts of Africa,
mhm, mhm,
and by evangelical and by the propaganda of
mhm,
evangelical, denominated sects
mhm,
that are now bringing this very belligerent kind of Christianity
mhm,
across the world,
mhm,
saying that there's Satan, they're talking about the devil, talking about the fact that there's poverty and so
mhm,
on, is
mhm,
because there are people conspiring within the community.
mhm.
And this has been an incredible, and I'm very, very, very disturbed that the feminist movement international has not paid more attention to it. Yeah.
Well, maybe let's take a little bit of a sidetrack then, because, and this might be quite a difficult question. It might be impossible for you to answer, but I am very surprised, having read your book and another couple of ecofeminist texts, and seeing just how rigorous the research was, how realistic and grounded the research was. And by that, I mean scholarship that was showing the material connection between violences and bodies and earth bodies, and really creating an ecosystem, revealing the ecosystem of oppression, which would then suggest the ecosystem of liberation. It then sort of dries up. I mean, there is no where are the big feminist texts in the past decade? And I mean the books. Where's the big feminist text in the last decade that continues that scholarship? Because it seems like after sort of maybe coinciding with the economic crash, feminism does not continue with this like super materialist analysis of what is happening. It sort of
No,
goes elsewhere.
no, no, no. I mean, look, the work of Maria Mies, for example. Okay, she died, but their work is fundamental. Patriarchy and accumulation on a world scale. Ecofeminism that she wrote with Vandana Shiva. The work of women in Argentina, Veronica Gago, Raquel Gutierrez, Rita Segato. I think there is a tremendous, tremendous feminist literature
Sorry.
in our time. Yeah.
Please let me reframe the question. I am surprised that this kind of feminism, this like very material feminism that exposes the ecosystems of oppression and suggests the ecosystems of liberation that is grounded in the body, is not more taken up by the wider feminist movement. Say, there we go.
Well, I think there's a difference. I think I would agree that, for example, I think in the United States we don't have a real feminist movement.
Mhm.
That's been my complaint for a long time, because there are many feminists, there are some feminist activity, but when I look, for example, at the situation of in Latin America, for example, in Argentina, where I see, repeatedly thousands and thousands of women in the state, and not only thousands and thousands of women, but a movement is the ability of women coming from different groups, from different political spaces, of coming together, discussing, setting agenda. You probably know that every year on October 12th, which now used to be called Il Dia de la Raza, they call it the Day of Resistance. It's the day of rebellion, against the whole Columbus Day. They come together every year, they choose a city in Argentina. They've done this for 30 years, where all the different groups come together. Last time, I think there were about 70,000 women.
Wow.
And for a week, they discuss, they debate, and so on. And they begin to set the terrain they set the agenda for the political work of the coming year.
Mm.
This, and you have a feminist movement that is very rooted and interconnected with popular, grassroots movement, with campesino movement, with the movement of the unemployed, etc. I think that this, I think, is different in Europe and in the United States, where there's been perhaps more possibility for women to enter certain areas of wage labor. And so there's been much more actually stress on struggling to enter particular area. But I'm not saying that there's no struggle in the US. There's always like big demonstration for the issue of abortion. But it's a very kind of difference. You don't have a movement that really comes together. A movement they are actually so I say that the situation of feminism is very different, and you know, I- for example, I'm that's why I'm very attracted to the feminist movement in Latin America,
Mhm.
and I see also many important popular movements.
Mhm.
For example, take the MST, the landless movement in Brazil, or take Via Campesina they have a very feminist perspective. So feminism has also entered into mass organization, mass movements, who now, have realized, for example, women in the landless movement of Brazil, they have realized that in order, it's not enough to take over land, to reclaim the land. Then what you do with it, how do you organize it? And they realize that unless you have a feminist perspective, much of those gains can be gone. And this to me is the movement food sovereignty is led by women throughout the many parts of the world.
I think as a European who reads
Yeah,
predominantly in English, I'm just very curious as to what feels like yet another dislocation, another dematerialization of the
mm,
body
yeah,
in the feminist
mm,
movement recently. And perhaps that is because women have had more opportunity to sort of enter the
yeah,
system, if you will, and
mm,
maybe reform it from
yeah,
the inside. But
yeah.
also maybe the fact that, our bodies come from a lineage where this system has been practicing its techniques on us for, over 500
So
years.
in Europe and United States, and one of the things that have been inspired is also the movement of domestic workers. I've
Mm,
written about this very powerful domestic workers movement, while touching on every aspect of women's lives.
mm,
I'm thinking of movement like Territorio Domestico in Spain, for instance. That in fact they have continued some of the most important element, of the feminist analysis and feminist struggle,
mhm,
saying, for example, without us, nothing moves.
mhm,
Showing how actually women's work has been central to the possibility, the reproduction of life
mhm,
and the reproduction of capital.
mhm,
And, so I think that there are too, in Europe too, certainly there are movement. But I would agree that it's really particularly in what used to be called the third world,
yeah,
in the formerly colonized world and now recolonized,
mhm,
because we are witnessing a whole process of recolonization
mhm,
that I think women are leading, particularly against extractivism. Yeah, and so we need an anti-war movement. We need a feminist anti-war, anti-militarization. We need a movement of women, for example, the fight against women joining the army, the fight against men joining the army.
mhm,
And in Europe, I don't know if you know the work. That's a work that, if you read some French, Jules Falquet. You should read the work of Jules Falquet because she's one of the main feminist writers today. And she has written very, 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 very important things on the question of male violence.
mhm,
She has also been very inspired by women in Latin America. In fact, she writes, yeah. But also, she has been pointing out that, one of the main element today in the, reinstitution of a very patriarchal, violently patriarchal world has been the growing militarization of life on so many levels. And the fact that the main job today for men, the one job that is open to all men across the world, no matter where they are, is the world of fighting.
mm,
In other words, the world of caring is a jobs that involve the use of arms. Whether you are a security guard, whether you are a soldier, where you are involved in many of the surveillance, etc. So that in fact the proliferation of armed men,
mm,
right? And the immense expansion of police bodies, the immense expansion of like the ICE now. We are seeing it in the United States now. All this huge amount of money that is being thrown by this new beautiful bill that Trump has just passed. Huge to a massive, massive expansion. So prison guards, security guards, armed, armies. This is one job that any man can now enter to. If you are homeless, if you're jobless, you can always. And she's saying this has become part also of the new violence against women.
Right.
The proliferation of men will now negotiate all their activity through violence.
Mm.
Those same men carry their violence in their interpersonal relation with their children, with their wife, with their lovers. They, used to be you could leave a man. Now it's a threat if you leave a man because the man could kill you, and so on. So that's a very, very important element.
Hugely fascinating. And I think it speaks to this.
Militarization of life, the militarization of everyday life.
Mm.
Yeah.
It speaks to this economy of death that is
Yeah.
grown through violent
Yeah.
strategies,
Yeah.
that I feel like is something that how do I put this? It's very interesting to me that not only are we destroying Earth's capacity to reproduce
Mhm.
herself and controlling women's capacity to
Mhm.
reproduce themselves, but also the fact that there's now um, human-made things now outweigh all living things on planet Earth.
Mhm.
There is this
Yeah.
sort of
There's a there's a production of scarcity and production of death.
mhm, mhm,
Capitalism, production of scarcity and production of death.
yeah, yeah. But just how um the speed at which death can happen, which is obviously also an organic and biological thing. I mean, it takes so long for life to come into this world. And then for life to support itself, it needs to develop relationships and be interconnected and exist within an ecosystem. And death can happen in an instant. And just the rate at which human beings are consuming, it's not just this deliberate engineering of scarcity, but there seems to be this relationship as well between the exponential speed of growth and therefore
Mm.
the exponential sort of poisoning and speed of death occurring all over the world, not just of
Yeah.
human beings but more than human beings as well,
Yeah.
our kinfolk.
Animals,
Yeah.
every day,
Mhm.
pieces of animals are destroyed.
Mhm.
Yeah. The animals are now,
Everything.
and with the waters have been, well, the earth is being desertified.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, it's a very sobering truth to realize that 100 years from now, there will be much less water than we have,
Mhm.
and there will be entire areas of the world that will not be able to produce food.
Mhm.
And meanwhile, the waters of the seas will be rising at a rate that appears to be much faster than what it was ever imagined.
Yes. Yes.
And so there will be entire areas of the world submerged at the same time that there will be not enough water coming down from the skies
Mhm.
to actually allow for the reproduction of life.
Mhm. And then also how this impacts women's bodies in particular, because in times of ecological shock, economic
What's
shock, violence
mm,
increases.
it's already happening.
Mhm.
It's already happening,
Mhm.
and life expectancy. I think you should look at the rate of life expectancy because I think life expectancy are going down,
Well, they've
and particularly
gone down
women.
in the
Yeah,
United States in particular over the past decade.
yeah.
Mm.
So it's a very, very, very dire picture that
Mhm.
we have,
Mhm.
and but I look at those areas in which, in fact, I see that there is also a response. I think that in many places, people are not accepting to fade away into into oblivion,
Mhm.
but they're in fact reorganizing, and in fact, reclaiming land, organizing to have more autonomy,
Mhm.
autonomous forms of reproduction. I think women have been very important
Mhm.
in the process, are very important in that process. Organizing more. Yeah.
Yeah. There is always
Mm.
some sort of hope, resistance. There is always an opposite
Yeah.
reaction.
Talking about resisting, I don't know, like whether you hope or not,
Mm.
I think you have to do something.
And I think
Children have been born. You cannot tell them, sorry, you came too late.
mhm. Mhm.
You came too late.
Mhm.
There's nothing we can do for you.
Mhm.
And so we have to find, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think that's the best note to end it on, Sylvia, as well. Thank you so much for your time. My final question before I let you go is who would you like to
Right.
platform?
Oh, well, I would say Do you know the work of Veronica Gago?
No.
Oh my God. You really have to check. Yeah. She's Argentinian. She is involved in Una Menos. And I would say check Veronica Gago and or Jules Falquet. Jules Falquet in France. I think Jules Falquet is fantastic. Veronica is fantastic. There are many, many, many women.
Brilliant.
Yes.
Sylvia, this has been an extraordinary conversation. Thank you so much for your time, and thank you for your many, many years of research into this incredibly important reality. If you want to learn more, I've put links to everything in the description box below. Remember to subscribe to the channel if you're new here and share the episode if you enjoyed it. To support the show, subscribe at planetcritical.com, where you can read the weekly newsletter. You can also become a Planet Critical patron. All links are in the description box below. As always, my deepest thanks to that community. Planet Critical wouldn't exist without your support. Thank you everyone for listening and for coming on this journey together.